For decades, Africa has spoken about unity, integration, and building a future shaped by Africans themselves. But there is a question that exposes how far the continent still has to go. Why can an African citizen still find it difficult or expensive to visit another African country? Burkina Faso has now placed that question back at the center of the debate. In September 2025, under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traore, the government approved a policy removing visa fees for citizens of African countries. The distinction matters. Burkina Faso did not abolish visas for every African traveler. Applicants who require a visa must still apply online, undergo review, and receive approval. What changes is that an African citizen whose application is approved will not pay the visa fee. On paper, that may appear to be a modest administrative change, but the question behind it is much larger. If Africans are expected to trade with one another, invest in one another's economies, visit relatives, build companies, and create a more integrated continent, how much friction should governments place between them? That question goes far beyond Burkina Faso. It reaches into the meaning of Pan-African cooperation itself. It also forces us to examine an uncomfortable contradiction. Africa is working toward a continental market, yet movement between many African countries still requires advanced visas. Meanwhile, governments must also protect borders, verify identities, and respond to security risks. So this is not an argument for simply opening every border tomorrow. It is an examination of whether Africa can make movement easier without surrendering sovereignty or security. In this video, we will look at what Burkina Faso actually changed, why Ibrahim Traore's Pan-African vision matters, what other African countries are already doing, and what easier movement could mean for trade and integration. We will also examine the risks and the international contrast surrounding visa policy. If you want coverage of the decisions shaping Africa's sovereignty and future, follow this channel. Because behind one visa decision lies a much bigger question. Can Africans build one future together while remaining strangers at each other's borders? The contradiction becomes clearer when we look beyond Burkina Faso and examine how Africans travel across their continent. According to the 2025 Africa Visa Openness Index, only 28.2% of travel scenarios between African countries allowed visa-free entry. Another 20.4% offered a visa on arrival, but 51.1% still required travelers to obtain a visa before beginning their journey. That figure needs to be understood carefully. It does not mean that 51.1% of Africans are forbidden from traveling across Africa. It measures travel relationships between African countries. In more than half of those cases, a traveler must secure permission before departure. Think about what that means in ordinary life. A grandmother may want to visit relatives across a border. A small business owner may want to meet a potential customer. A young entrepreneur may see an opportunity in another African market. A family may want to spend a holiday somewhere else on the continent. Before any of them can make that journey, the visa process may introduce applications, fees, waiting periods, and uncertainty. The contradiction becomes even more striking because Africa is simultaneously trying to deepen economic integration. Governments have spent years discussing a continental market, regional trade, and cooperation. Yet the people expected to create those relationships do not always move as easily as the political vision suggests. There has been progress. Some countries have removed visa requirements, others issue visas on arrival, and electronic applications have reduced paperwork in many places. But the overall picture remains fragmented. A passport that moves easily through one part of Africa may face different requirements in another. That is why Burkina Faso's decision matters beyond the money saved by a traveler. It brings attention to a structural question that Africa has not fully answered. If a continent wants its businesses to trade more, its families to connect more, and its citizens to see neighboring countries as part of a shared economic future, should crossing an African border remain this complicated? And if the answer is no, the next question is, what governments can realistically change without weakening border controls? Burkina Faso's policy becomes more interesting when we separate what changed from what did not. The government did not announce that every African citizen could simply arrive at the border without authorization. Instead, it removed the visa fee for African nationals while keeping the application and approval process in place. For travelers who require a visa, the sequence remains straightforward. They submit an application online. The authorities examine the information. If the application is accepted, the traveler receives the visa without paying the visa fee. Burkina Faso therefore removes a financial barrier without surrendering its authority to decide who may enter the country. That distinction is essential because free visa and visa-free do not mean the same thing. A visa-free system removes the requirement to obtain a visa for eligible travelers. Burkina Faso's policy, by contrast, keeps the visa requirement where it applies, but makes an approved visa free of charge for African citizens. This approach reveals something important about the debate. African integration does not have to begin with governments abandoning border controls. It can begin by asking which costs and procedures remain necessary and which can be reduced without compromising security. The government presented the measure as part of a broader Pan-African vision. Its stated goals include strengthening the free movement of African people and goods and encouraging deeper African integration. That turns what might look like a small administrative adjustment into a political message. Burkina Faso is saying that an African traveler should face one less obstacle when seeking to enter another African country. But the policy also has limits. Applicants can still be reviewed and rejected. They must still comply with entry requirements. The measure does not automatically provide residency, employment rights, or unrestricted movement. That balance is precisely why the decision deserves attention. Burkina Faso has not erased its border. It has changed one condition at that border. And that raises a practical question for the rest of Africa. If governments can preserve screening while removing unnecessary costs, how many other barriers could be reconsidered without giving up sovereignty or public security? To understand why this visa decision carries political weight, we have to look at Ibrahim Traore without turning the story into a celebration of one man. Traore did not invent Pan Africanism, and Burkina Faso is not the first African country to reduce travel barriers. What matters is how his government is connecting Pan-African language with a visible policy. Traore chaired the Council of Ministers that approved the visa fee measure on the 11th of September 2025. Later that month, when he received motorcycle riders representing several African countries, his message centered on African unity, regional integration, and the ability of Africans to move more freely across their own continent. That fits a broader theme in his leadership. Traore has repeatedly placed sovereignty, African cooperation, economic independence, and solidarity at the center of his political message. For supporters, this helps explain why his influence has reached beyond Burkina Faso. He has become an important symbol for a segment of the Pan-African public that believes political independence means little without greater economic and strategic independence. But influence should not be confused with universal support. Traore does not speak for every African, and his government faces serious questions of its own. Nor should this visa policy be presented as proof that Burkina Faso has solved the problem of continental movement. Rwanda and Gambia have already gone further by allowing African citizens visa-free entry. The significance of Traore's role is therefore different. His government has taken an idea often heard in speeches and attached it to something travelers can experience directly. An African applicant may still face screening. The border remains under national control, but one financial barrier has been removed. That creates a challenge for other leaders. Not a demand to copy Burkina Faso exactly, but a question about their own systems. If African governments say they want greater African integration, which rules genuinely protect national interests and which rules could be changed? That may ultimately be more important than whether Traore was first. Leadership can also mean forcing an old question back onto the continental agenda. Burkina Faso is not acting alone. Across Africa, Several governments have already experimented with different ways of making continental travel easier. Looking at those examples is important because they show that African countries do not have to follow one identical model. Rwanda and Gambia provide two of the clearest examples. By 2025, both allowed citizens from other African countries to enter without first obtaining a visa. In that respect, they have gone further than Burkina Faso. Their experience also corrects an important misconception. The movement toward easier African travel did not begin with Ibrahim Traore, and it does not belong to one political leader. Kenya has followed another path, introducing major changes to its electronic travel authorization system and expanding exemptions for many African travelers. Other governments have relied on visas on arrival, electronic visas, bilateral agreements, or regional arrangements. Taken together, these policies form a kind of African laboratory. One country removes visa fees, another offers visas at the border, another eliminates visas for African citizens altogether. Each government is trying to balance openness with its own security, economic, and administrative concerns. This experimentation also reveals why continental integration remains difficult. Africa is not one government with one immigration system. It is a continent of more than 50 sovereign states, each with its own laws, borders, labor concerns, security pressures, and political priorities. The African Union recognized the larger challenge years ago. In 2018, African leaders adopted a protocol intended to advance free movement across the continent. Yet, ratification has moved slowly. The political vision exists, but translating that vision into national law has proved much harder. That is why Burkina Faso should be understood as part of a longer African story rather than an isolated revolution. Its decision adds another model to the debate. The real question is whether these separate experiments can eventually produce something larger. If Rwanda can remove visas, Gambia can do the same, Kenya can simplify access, and Burkina Faso can eliminate visa fees, could successful national policies gradually become regional standards? Africa may already know where it wants to go. The harder problem is getting dozens of sovereign governments to move in that direction together. The freedom to travel is not only about tourism or visiting family. It can also determine whether African businesses are able to find customers, meet partners, and invest in neighboring markets. That is where the visa debate becomes an economic question. Imagine a small business owner who discovers an opportunity in another African country. Before signing an agreement, that person may need to visit the market, inspect facilities, meet suppliers, and build trust with local partners. If the journey requires an advanced visa, additional fees, long waiting periods, and complicated paperwork, the opportunity becomes more expensive before business even begins. Multiply that difficulty across thousands of entrepreneurs, traders, engineers, investors, and professionals, and border friction can become an economic cost. This matters because Africa is trying to build the African Continental Free Trade Area, an ambitious project designed to create a more integrated market for goods and services. Yet recent African Union figures indicate that trade within Africa still represents only about 1/6 of the continent's total trade. That exposes another contradiction. Governments can reduce tariffs and encourage African products to cross borders, but businesses are ultimately run by people. A shipment may need a manager. An investment may require an inspection. A contract may depend on two people sitting at the same table. Experience in East Africa offers an important lesson. The African Union has highlighted reforms involving Rwanda, Kenya, and Uganda alongside substantial growth in cross-border trade. That does not prove that easier movement alone caused the increase. Trade depends on infrastructure, regulations, demand, investment, and many other factors, but it demonstrates why mobility deserves a place in the economic discussion. Burkina Faso's visa fee decision will not transform African trade by itself. Removing one fee cannot repair roads, create direct flights, simplify customs, or build payment systems, but it can reduce one piece of friction. And that leads to a larger question. If Africa wants a continental market, should it focus only on helping African goods move more freely, or should it also make it easier for the African entrepreneurs, workers, investors, and families behind those goods to cross borders and build relationships? The deepest contradiction may not be at the border itself. It may be inside Africa's own integration system. African governments have moved much faster toward creating a common market for goods than toward guaranteeing easier movements for the people who produce, sell, and buy those goods. By August 2025, 49 countries had ratified and deposited their instruments for the African Continental Free Trade Area. That represents broad political support for reducing barriers to commerce across the continent. But the African Union's Free Movement Protocol tells a different story. The protocol was adopted in 2018, yet only 4 countries had ratified it in the research reviewed for this story. 15 ratifications are required before it can enter into force. Why is movement of people proving so much harder? Part of the answer is security. Governments need reliable systems to identify travelers and prevent criminal networks from exploiting easier borders. Another concern is employment. Leaders may fear that rapid opening could create pressure on local labor markets or public services. There are also practical problems involving civil registration, passport systems, information sharing, and the ability of immigration authorities to verify identities. These concerns should not simply be dismissed as excuses. A country has a legitimate responsibility to know who is entering its territory and to protect its citizens. Integration that ignores security could lose public trust very quickly, but the opposite danger also deserves attention. If every legitimate concern becomes a reason to postpone reform indefinitely, Africa can remain committed to free movement on paper while preserving the same obstacles in practice. That is why the Burkina Faso example is useful. It does not require governments to choose between complete openness and complete restriction. A country can maintain screening while reconsidering fees and procedures. The challenge for the African Union and national governments is therefore not to erase sovereignty. It is to make sovereignty work alongside integration. Africa has already shown considerable willingness to build a common trading space. The unfinished question is whether political leaders can create enough trust, technology, and cooperation to make movement of people advance with it. The contrast becomes sharper when we look beyond Africa. Beginning the 1st of August 2026, the United States reorganized routine visa services across parts of the continent, moving processing from a number of diplomatic posts to designated regional hubs. Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, Bamako in Mali, and Niamey in Niger were among the locations affected. For some African applicants, that can make an American visa more complicated to pursue. Instead of completing the normal process in their own country, they may have to travel to another nation. That can mean an international flight, hotel expenses, meals, transportation, time away from work, and possibly additional entry requirements before the applicant even reaches an American consular officer. Now, place that beside what Burkina Faso is doing. Washington is concentrating some visa services into regional centers. Ouagadougou is removing a financial barrier for African citizens seeking approved visas to Burkina Faso. One system may increase the practical distance some Africans must travel for a visa interview, while the other is trying to reduce one cost of movement within Africa. But this comparison needs balance. There is no reliable evidence that Washington reorganized its African visa system because of Ibrahim Traore or because it opposes Burkina Faso's free visa fee policy. The United States says its approach is intended to improve security screening, consistency, resource allocation, and operational efficiency. Those are legitimate responsibilities of a sovereign government. America has the right to design an immigration system around what it considers its national interest, just as African governments have the right to protect their own borders. And that is where the comparison becomes more meaningful. The question is not whether America is right and Burkina Faso is wrong, or the reverse. The question is what African governments define as their own collective interest. If Washington can reorganize visa policy according to American priorities, African capitals can also ask whether their border systems support African priorities. Should those priorities include easier business travel, stronger regional ties, and fewer unnecessary costs between African citizens? That is a sovereignty question, not an anti-Western argument. Every government protects its interest. The challenge for Africa is deciding what African integration requires in practice. Greater mobility, however, cannot mean pretending that borders no longer matter. Every African government has a responsibility to protect its citizens, verify travelers, and respond to criminal networks, human trafficking, illegal migration, and security threats. These concerns become serious in regions already facing armed violence and political instability. That is why the Burkina Faso model is worth examining. The country has removed the visa fee for African citizens, but it has not abandoned screening. Travelers who require visas still submit applications and wait for approval. In other words, the government is attempting to reduce one barrier while preserving control over entry. Technology can help with that balance. By 2025, 31 African countries offered electronic visa systems. Electronic applications can reduce paperwork and save travelers a trip to an embassy. They can also make requirements easier to understand before a journey begins. But an electronic visa is still a visa. A traveler still needs permission in advance. Digital systems can also create new problems, including unreliable websites, online fraud, limited internet access, and difficulties for older travelers who are less comfortable with technology. So, Africa faces a more sophisticated question than whether borders should be opened or closed. Does the continent need better visas, or does it need fewer situations in which Africans require visas at all? The answer may differ from country to country. Some governments may be ready for visa-free travel. Others may prefer visas on arrival, electronic screening, or free applications like Burkina Faso. The larger goal should be smarter borders. That means identifying risks while allowing legitimate travelers to move with less unnecessary expense and delay. Integration without security is difficult to sustain, but security that makes African movement unnecessarily burdensome can also weaken integration. The challenge is building a system capable of doing both. The lesson from Burkina Faso is not that every African country should copy the same policy tomorrow. The continent is too diverse for one border system to fit every government. Security conditions, labor markets, administrative capacity, and migration pressures differ widely. But every government can ask whether its current barriers still serve a necessary purpose. The first lesson is that countries do not have to wait for all of Africa to move together. A government can reduce fees, simplify applications, improve electronic screening, introduce visas on arrival, or expand visa-free access while broader African Union negotiations continue. The second lesson is that easier movement requires stronger administration, not weaker administration. Reliable identity systems, secure travel documents, information sharing, and capable border officers can help governments distinguish legitimate travelers from genuine threats. The third lesson is that visas are only one part of integration. Africans also need affordable transportation, better roads and air connections, easier payments, efficient customs procedures, and practical opportunities to work, invest, and build businesses across borders. The fourth lesson is patience with accountability. Reform can be gradual, but governments should publish rules, measure results, correct failures, and explain why restrictions remain when citizens bear cost. This is where Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traore become part of a much larger African conversation. The same debate reaches Mali and Niger, where Assimi Goïta and Abdourahmane Chani have emphasized sovereignty within the Sahel. It reaches West Africa, the African Union, and relations with France and other outside powers. For anyone following Africa news, the lasting issue should not be which leader produces the strongest slogan. It should be whether policy makes African cooperation more practical. Ibrahim Traore has not solved Africa's movement problem, Burkina Faso is not even the continent's most open country, but removing visa fees gives his Pan-African message a policy that ordinary travelers can understand. The challenge now belongs to other governments as well. Which restrictions genuinely protect their people and which simply make African connection more expensive? If you believe this debate deserves attention, follow this channel and share your view in the comments. Should your country make it easier for other Africans to visit while keeping effective security controls? Because the final question is larger than one visa, one president, or one country. If Africans intend to build Africa's future together, how easy should it be for them to walk through one another's doors? We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.